The young man's harsh words toward his disabled father drew the attention of a silent royal guard, who decided to step in and teach a lesson no one would forget. It was a bright and busy afternoon in the heart of the city, where tourists from all over the world had gathered to admire the grandeur of the royal monument. The square buzzed with excitement as people snapped photos, exchanged stories, and marveled at the towering statues that symbolized centuries of history and tradition. Among the crowd was a father and his young son, weaving slowly through the throng. The father sat in a wheelchair, his movements measured and deliberate as he guided himself forward with careful turns of the wheels. His face carried a warm, gentle smile as he looked up at his son, who walked a few steps ahead, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Isn't this incredible?" the father said, his voice full of genuine awe. "You can almost feel the history here. I've been waiting so long to show you this." The son, tall and lanky with a phone clutched in his hand, glanced over his shoulder with an impatient sigh. "Yeah, Dad, it's fine," he muttered, barely meeting his father's gaze. He looked around, his eyes scanning the square, not for the monument, but for anyone who might be watching. The sight of his father in the wheelchair seemed to gnaw at him. "Could we maybe move a little faster? You're holding up everyone behind us." The father's expression faltered for a moment, his hands pausing on the wheels. "I'm sorry, son," he said softly. "I'll try to keep up." His words carried an undertone of sadness, though he did his best to mask it. Nearby, a royal guard stood stiffly at his post, his crimson coat and tall bearskin hat blending seamlessly into the regal setting. His eyes remained forward, seemingly indifferent to the ebb and flow of tourists around him. But behind that stoic expression, he noticed everything. His keen gaze flickered briefly to the father and son as he quietly observed their interaction. As the father struggled to maneuver the wheelchair over a cobblestone path, the son let out an audible groan. "Dad, seriously, can't you just ask someone to help or something? This is taking forever." The father's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wheels, his voice steady but tinged with hurt. "I can manage, son. I just need a little more time." The boy shook his head, stepping aside and crossing his arms as though distancing himself from the situation might make it less embarrassing. His words cut sharper this time. "You're always so slow. Everywhere we go, it's the same thing. Do you even realize how much of a hassle this is for me?" A few passers-by slowed, their conversations pausing as they glanced over at the unfolding scene. Some looked on with pity, others with subtle disapproval. The father's cheeks flushed, but he forced a small smile, speaking gently to his son. "I just wanted to share this moment with you. I thought it would be something we could remember together." Unbeknownst to them, the royal guard had taken a step closer, his boots clicking against the cobblestones. His sharp, disciplined eyes were now fully trained on the son, his expression unreadable, but his stance resolute. He didn't move further or speak, yet his presence seemed to carry an unspoken weight, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The bustling square seemed to quiet slightly as the air grew heavier, tension building subtly between the boy's irritation, the father's quiet dignity, and the silent figure watching them from afar. Something was about to shift, but neither the son nor the father could see it coming. The crowd in the bustling square continued to move around the father and son, but the tension between them grew more palpable with every passing moment. The father, seated in his wheelchair, attempted to keep pace with the boy, who now walked a few steps ahead, his body language exuding frustration. The father's gentle voice carried over the noise of the crowd as he said, "I'm sorry, son. These cobblestones make it a bit harder to move quickly." "Just a moment." The son rolled his eyes and turned back toward his father, his face contorted with visible annoyance. "Dad, seriously, how hard is it to just push yourself faster? It's not like you're climbing a mountain," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to draw the attention of nearby tourists. The father paused, adjusting his grip on the wheels of his chair. His cheeks flushed faintly, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm doing my best, son. I didn't mean to slow you down." "That's the problem," the son exclaimed, his voice louder now, catching the ears of more passersby. "You always slow me down. Everywhere we go, it's the same thing. Why can't you just—" He cut himself off, realizing how harsh his words sounded, but the damage was already done. A woman nearby, holding her child's hand, glanced at the scene with a mixture of shock and pity. Another tourist whispered something to their companion, shaking their head. The murmur of disapproval in the air grew louder, but the son seemed oblivious, too wrapped up in his own irritation to notice. The father adjusted his glasses, his gaze softening as he looked up at his son. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said quietly. "I just wanted to spend some time with you and see this place together. If you'd rather, we can leave." The son groaned, throwing his hands into the air in exasperation. "No, we're already here. Let's just get this over with. But you don't have to talk to me like I'm 5, okay? I'm not a kid." The father's expression faltered for a moment, the faint hurt in his eyes unmistakable. Still, he offered a small, kind smile and nodded. "Of course," he said softly. The tension between them continued to build, and the Royal Guard stationed nearby remained at attention, his disciplined gaze fixed straight ahead. Yet, anyone watching closely would notice the subtle shift in his stance, the way his eyes flickered toward the father and son. He had noticed the son's tone and the father's attempts to stay composed, and something in his demeanor suggested he was paying closer attention now. The son, growing more impatient, sighed audibly as the father struggled to navigate over a rough patch of cobblestone. "You always make everything so difficult," he muttered, not caring who heard him. "Why can't you just make things easy for once?" A small gasp came from the crowd, and the father, his hands trembling slightly on the wheelchair's handles, stopped moving altogether. His face remained calm, but his voice cracked ever so slightly as he said, "I never wanted to make things hard for you. I'm sorry." It was at that moment the Royal Guard shifted, his boots clicking softly against the stones. Though he remained silent, his presence suddenly felt far more imposing, like the weight of centuries of tradition and discipline had condensed into this one figure. A few members of the crowd turned their attention to the guard, sensing that something was about to happen. The son, still oblivious to the guard's watchful gaze, huffed and crossed his arms, muttering under his breath, "Let's just get this over with." The father gave a small nod and pushed forward once more, the hurt in his expression concealed behind his soft-spoken words. Little did they know, the Royal Guard had seen enough. Something was about to shift, and the son's behavior was about to meet an unexpected challenge. The Royal Guard, who had been standing silently at his post, suddenly stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones. His tall figure, clad in the pristine ceremonial uniform, seemed to cast a shadow over the square. The murmurs from the crowd hushed as people turned their attention to the unexpected movement. Breaking protocol was unheard of for a royal guard, and yet here he was, walking directly toward the father and son. The son froze, startled by the imposing figure now approaching them. His expression quickly shifted from confusion to irritation. "What do you want?" he snapped, crossing his arms defensively. "Mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you." The guard stopped a few feet away, his posture straight and commanding, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "Respectfully, young man, it has everything to do with me. When I see someone being treated unfairly, especially someone who cannot defend themselves, I cannot stand idly by." The son scoffed, rolling his eyes again. "It's not unfair. He's my father. I can talk to him however I want. Why do you care?" The guard's eyes, sharp and steady, softened as he glanced at the father sitting quietly in his wheelchair. Then, he turned back to the son, his voice firm but not unkind. "Because I know what it's like to wish you could speak to your father one more time, to show him respect and gratitude for all he did for you." A silence fell over the square as the guard continued, his tone now laced with a quiet sorrow that drew everyone in. "My father was the one who taught me what it means to be strong, to stand tall, and to always treat others with kindness. He was the first person who showed me that compassion is a strength, not a weakness. He believed in me, even when I doubted myself." The son blinked, his defiance faltering under the weight of the guard's words. His posture stiffened, as if trying to shield himself from the unexpected wave of emotion. The guard's voice grew quieter, but his words carried across the square. "But life doesn't last forever. My father fell ill when I was barely your age. And before I knew it, he was gone." His voice trembled slightly, but he remained composed. "Do you know what it'd give to hear his voice again? To thank him for all the sacrifices he made for me? To simply tell him I loved him one more time?" The son's face began to flush, his bravado melting away. He glanced at his father, who sat quietly, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, his eyes filled with both sadness and pride. "Every moment you spend with your father," the guard continued, his gaze unwavering, "is a gift. Not everyone gets the chance to cherish those moments. And when they're gone, no amount of regret can bring them back." The crowd stood silent, captivated by the unexpected confrontation. Even those who had initially just been passing by now stopped, moved by the guard's heartfelt words. The son's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. His shoulders slumped as the guard's message finally hit home. The guard, now standing close enough to look the son directly in the eye, added softly, "If you have the privilege of calling someone dad, treat that privilege with the respect it deserves. You don't get a second chance to do it right." The weight of his words hung in the air as the son looked down, unable to meet the guard's gaze. The father, his voice trembling, finally spoke. "Thank you," he whispered to the guard, his gratitude evident. The guard gave a small nod, stepping back, his stoic demeanor returning. The son, however, was left to grapple with the powerful lesson he had just been taught. The guard stood tall, his eyes scanning the crowd before resting on the son. His voice, calm but resolute, carried an authority that silenced every murmur in the square. "Family," he began, "is the most precious bond we will ever have. It's the foundation that shapes who we are and the people we become. Yet, too often, we take it for granted." The son looked up, his earlier defiance replaced by discomfort. The guard's gaze, unwavering and piercing, seemed to see through him. "A father's love," the guard continued, "is not something you can measure with words or gestures. It's in the sacrifices he makes, often silently. The long hours he works, the dreams he puts aside, and the strength he finds to give you opportunities he may never have had." The crowd hung on every word, many nodding in quiet agreement. Some whispered to each other, others just stood in reflective silence. A woman in the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue as the weight of the guard's words resonated deeply. The guard turned to the father, seated in his wheelchair, his hands folded neatly on his lap. "And disability," he said, his tone softening but no less powerful, "is not a weakness. It's a sign of resilience, of someone who continues to face life with courage despite its challenges. It takes strength to live with dignity when the world around you often forgets to show you kindness." The father looked down, visibly moved, but still carrying an air of quiet pride. The son glanced at his father, his face softening as the guard's words struck a chord. "Your father," the guard said, his voice now tinged with emotion, "has likely faced struggles you may never understand. But he doesn't share them with you to earn your pity. He shares them because he loves you. and because he wants you to grow into someone who will do the same for others someday." The son's lip trembled, and he blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. The crowd, too, felt the emotional weight of the moment. A man in the back whispered, "He's right," while others nodded in agreement, wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed. The guard continued, "Life is fleeting. We think we have all the time in the world, but in reality, it's slipping away faster than we realize. Don't let your pride, your impatience, or your embarrassment rob you of the time you have with those who love you the most. Because when they're gone," his voice faltered momentarily, "all you'll be left with are memories and regret." The son couldn't hold back any longer. Tears streamed down his face as he turned to his father, the realization of his actions hitting him like a wave. The father, though initially hesitant to meet his gaze, reached out and took his son's hand in a gesture of forgiveness. The guard stepped back slightly, his stoic expression returning, though there was a faint glimmer of emotion in his eyes. The father turned to him, his voice trembling. "Thank you," he said softly, the gratitude in his tone unmistakable. The guard nodded, his presence a symbol of strength and compassion. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, a sign of respect not just for the guard's intervention, but for the deeply human lesson he had imparted. As the applause faded, the son wiped his tears and leaned down, whispering an apology to his father. The moment was raw, emotional, and unforgettable. The square fell silent as the guard took a step closer, his imposing figure now at the center of attention. His voice was calm yet carried the weight of someone who had seen life in its rawest forms. "There's something all of us need to remember," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before resting on the son. "Family is the foundation of everything we are. It's where we learn kindness, strength, and love. Without it, we're lost." The son shifted uncomfortably, his earlier defiance crumbling under the weight of the guard's words. "Your father," the guard continued, gesturing gently toward the man in the wheelchair, "has faced challenges most of us can't even imagine. But he's here, standing tall in his own way, not because it's easy, but because he loves you." The father's gaze dropped to his hands, his expression filled with both pride and quiet sadness. The crowd was visibly moved, many nodding along, their faces reflecting the emotions of the moment. A mother in the audience wrapped her arm around her child, while an elderly man wiped a tear from his cheek. "And you," the guard said, directing his attention fully to the son, "might not realize it yet, but every sacrifice he's made, every moment he's endured pain or hardship, was so you could have a better life. Do you know how many fathers wish they could be here for their children, to see them grow, to guide them? He's here, and that's a gift." The son's face softened, his earlier irritation replaced with shame. His eyes darted to his father, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable but dignified. "It's easy to forget," the guard went on, "that the people who love us the most won't always be here. Life is fleeting, and we think we have all the time in the world to show gratitude, to say thank you, to say, 'I love you.' But we don't." The crowd murmured in agreement, some wiping away tears. The son swallowed hard, his emotions bubbling to the surface as the guard's words pierced through his defenses. "And disabilities," the guard continued, his tone softening, "are not something to be ashamed of. They're a mark of resilience. Your father's strength is in every step he takes, in every struggle he overcomes. You should be proud of him." The son's lip trembled, and he finally broke down, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with genuine remorse. The father reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on his son's arm. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice carrying forgiveness and love. "All I've ever wanted is for you to be happy." The guard stepped back, his stoic expression returning, but his eyes betraying a hint of emotion. He nodded toward the father, a silent acknowledgement of respect. The crowd, unable to hold back, broke into gentle applause, a tribute to the profound lesson they had all just witnessed. As the father and son embraced, the air in the square felt lighter, filled with hope and a newfound sense of understanding. This heartfelt story reminds us of the importance of respect, compassion, and gratitude, especially for those who sacrifice so much for us. Let's take a moment to reflect on how we treat our loved ones and the value of kindness in our daily lives. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring and emotional stories.